Hello and welcome to Opwall's Field Notes, a podcast created by Operation Wallacea to share stories and insights from our 25 years working in the field. My name is Sophia Wood, Opwall's country manager for Ecuador and director of Friends of Wallacea, and I will be your host for this series. We launched this podcast to shine a light on the world of biodiversity field research and the work of those who dedicate their lives to understanding and protecting our planet. Each month, we have conversations with scientists, community conservationists, and experienced academics about new research, protecting biodiversity, and daily life out in the field. Today's guest on the podcast is Joe England, a British ornithologist who has worked with Opwalls in Fiji since 2017, helping set up the first research sites on the Natewa Peninsula. Joe is deeply passionate about birds, biodiversity, and the natural world, which shines through in his work and his words. He is eager to return to Fiji after the global lockdown to continue his research on the behavior of the rare, microendemic Natewa Silktail, a tiny bird that lives only on this peninsula. Through his work with Opwall and other research organizations, Joe has led and participated in biodiversity surveys all over the world, including in Peru, Australia, Borneo, and now Romania. In this episode, we discuss the origins of Joe's respect and love for nature, and birds in particular, what makes Fiji such a special and sometimes challenging place to work, and how to live a life committed to protecting biodiversity every day. Hi, Joe. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's nice to be able to do it with you guys. I've been waiting for my turn.
Good. Well, I'm glad we're able to give it to you now. So since we're taping everything from home, where are you based right now?
I'm in Romania at the moment, in a place called Hosman, working or kind of part of a collective, volunteering for an association here called Hosman Durabil, and initially came out here last year for Friends of Wallacea with you, or for you guys.
Cool. So how you've been living in Romania now for almost a year?
Yeah, almost a year. It's crazy. I was working it out in preparation for this, and it's been almost 11 months, which seems crazy to me. It doesn't feel like I've been out here a year. I managed to get home for Christmas for a month or two. But yeah, almost a year.
All right. Well, obviously, we had a couple of podcasts about Romania in our last session. So anyone who's interested in more about our Romania site, including the Friends of Wallacea site, can listen to Madalina's podcast from our previous set of podcasts about Romania. But, you're clearly originally from the UK, haven't been in Romania for all that long. So before Romania, you helped set up the Opwall site in Fiji when it first started in 2017. So what were your main goals when you first came to the site, and what were we trying to do?
It was a huge privilege to be asked to come to Fiji, as I'm sure you felt as well as part of the team. And it was, such a rare opportunity to be part of setting up a research site, a research project. And although Opwall has a whole load of research sites, never did I think I would be part of setting one up, and especially not in a place like Fiji. I remember I kind of applied for the sort of broad ornithologist role as they put out on the website. And it was for Mexico, Guyana, South Africa, I think, all of which would have been wonderful projects to be a part of. And I remember getting an email from Tim, the sort of boss, and he was like, "How does Fiji sound?" And I was just like, "Yeah, it sounds amazing." And I guess with any project when it's first being set up, with the Opwall projects at least, the main goal is to create a sort of baseline data set from which it acts as a foundation for all the future years' work that is going to take place there. So it was, for me, that was working with the birds, but for all of the taxonomic groups for which we were working with, that was really the main goal, to see what was there, sort of presence, absence data of these species, and to create, as I say, the foundation for future years' work. And I mean, for me personally, it was to see some of the marvelous wildlife that you can see there that exists nowhere else in the world. So.
Well, I think that leads us well into, one of my questions specifically about, the birds where we're working on in Fiji. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the specific area of Fiji where Opwall is working, the Natewa Peninsula, and then why conserving birds in this area is so special and so important?
Yeah, so the area we work on in Fiji is on Vanuatu, the second largest island, and specifically on that island, an area called the Natewa Peninsula. Now, this is kind of, biologically speaking, an almost island. Like, it's got a very thin isthmus, like the connection to the main part of the island. I think it's less than 5 kilometers wide or something like that. And that area is quite largely developed. And so you, as I say, you effectively have an island created by this peninsula. And it's quite a large area and large enough to hold some really unique and special habitats, which in turn leads to unique and special species of plants, butterflies, birds.
I was just going to say, talking to Sarah Carlson previously, who also runs the Fiji site and has been living in Fiji for several years, looking at that area and talking about the Natewa Peninsula with Sabu Sabu Bay as the kind of the largest bay, or Natewa Bay, sorry, the largest bay in the South Pacific, obviously, presumably would create a pretty natural separation from the rest of the island as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of reflected, the bay itself is so large that it kind of reflects how isolated this peninsula is. It basically is an island. If you go by the habitat that is there, I mean, they did a study looking at the climate of the Natewa Peninsula compared to elsewhere on Vanuatu and Taveuni, an offshore island. And it got far more rainfall than the rest of Vanuatu, just because of the sort of topography of how the rain comes over across the bay, over the mountains that are on the Natewa Peninsula. And so the rainfall on this peninsula is distinct in itself. And you add that onto sort of the isolation factor of these habitats of the area, and you basically have this entirely new, unique habitat and area where all these species have been isolated and evolving and adapting for hundreds of years, thousands of years.
That's fascinating. I've just learned something new in this podcast. And as you can probably tell, I actually know Joe personally from the first year that we were out in Fiji together setting up that site in 2017, which was my first Opwall expedition as well. So Natewa Peninsula is an incredibly unique area of the world biologically and physically. It's honestly just an incredibly stunning place. So what are some of these endemic birds that you are studying on the Natewa Peninsula that can't be found anywhere else?
It's crazy to think about endemic birds in Fiji, because I think there's about 26 endemic species of bird in Fiji. Now, that kind of doesn't mean much on its own, but if you think about the UK, it has one endemic species of bird, and it pretty much only occurs because the UK really wants an endemic species of bird. And so we've tried to like squeeze out this little taxonomic bird that should really be a subspecies, but it's got a slightly different call and a slightly different genetic makeup, and so we call it a endemic species. But these birds on Fiji, there could be double the number if the same taxonomic work was done on the birds there. I mean, of particular importance to the Natewa Peninsula itself is the Natewa Silktail, which is, as the name suggests, endemic not only to Fiji, not only to Vanuatu, but actually the Natewa Peninsula itself, which is remarkable for a bird, that it just doesn't disperse anywhere else. And it really goes to show just how unique the habitat is, the fact that it can't survive anywhere else. And so the Natewa Silktail has kind of become the focal point for me personally and for the ornithology work in as part of the project, just because of this kind of specialist status it has, and it's really local endemism. But most of the birds in Fiji, they have the prefix Fiji, so it's Fiji bush warbler, it's Fiji golden whistler, it's Fiji this, Fiji that, and any bird that has Fiji in front of it is an endemic. And so it's funny, like you write the bird list every morning as part of the point count, and you just put F because you can guess what it's going to be.
Wow, it sounds like an incredible place to work for a passionate ornithologist, or maybe anybody. But so before we move on, could you just tell us a little bit more about the Natewa Silktail? Obviously, this is an incredibly special and rare bird. How often do you see them, and how would you describe them? Are they small birds, big birds? What would people look for if they were to go out there?
So it's just like, my passion for this bird, I think, even from just the first year, but it's only increased since then. Like, it's probably my favorite bird in the world, which is saying something. And to start off with, when they first discovered it, they thought it was a bird of paradise. So one of this family of birds that kind of exists in Australia, Papua New Guinea, parts of Indonesia, and is restricted to those areas. And they're known for their fantastic plumages and rather strange dances and displays. And this bird is, it was considered a bird of paradise. So that gives you an idea of its appearance and how absurd it is. And there's a nice quote from one of the first people to observe this bird. And he said, "I scarcely remember a bird which has puzzled me so much as this curious little creature." And it really does sum up this bird. Like, when you first see it in the forest, it's just black. And that's partly because it really likes quite dense understory forest. And so there's not a lot of light coming down from the canopy. And so you just kind of see this black dot shuffling around. And it's got a very quick flight, and it hops a lot up branches, and so it just appears black. But because I spent months before going to Fiji looking through the bird book, that actually it's got this very iridescent, strange feathering on the back. And it wasn't until because we do mist netting in Fiji, which is where we catch and ring the birds, and it wasn't until the first silktail that I caught that I really sort of had a newfound appreciation for this bird. Like, I could go on endlessly about this bird, so I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But this iridescence is like a hummingbird, this light, it's structural coloration to the feather. So actually, whatever light you look at it in, it's slightly different: blue, purple, black. And aside from that, the wings are almost like velvet. And usually if you hold a feather up against the light, you can see through it, and you can kind of make out shapes on the other side of the feather. But these velvety flight feathers of the silktail are almost completely opaque, and they overlap with each other so much that there's kind of this added opaqueness as well. And it's very difficult to make out one feather from another. And then you combine this with its kind of namesake feature, which is the silk tail, which is this white, almost pearlescent patch on the rump of this bird that goes down onto the tail, and it kind of shines as well. So it's these kind of three completely different textures all crammed into this tiny little bird. And I mean, this is only its appearance, and its behavior is even more fascinating. Like, I think animal behavior and bird behavior is really my kind of passion, because trying to understand it and quantify it and research it. And this bird just continues to intrigue me. And it was in 2018, so the second year of the Fiji project, that me and my guide, Bill, found 4 nests of this bird. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but they were actually the first nests to have been found and observed ever. So it was remarkable that in 2 weeks we found 4 of these nests, and 2 of these nests were within 20 meters of each other. And that's quite unusual for a bird. Usually if you find 2 nests of the same species close to each other, they're a colonial bird, like something like a sparrow. They often nest in small colonies, and it's kind of this added protection, and often they're kind of related members of the same family. But this bird is not known to be colonial. It's not known to have this social behavior of traveling in family groups or whatever. And so the fact that these nests were so close to each other, and I'd already had suspicions about the social and foraging behavior of these birds, and kind of the breeding structure was already kind of strange for me. And so these nests just kind of added this massive like bombshell into this question as to what the hell is going on with these birds and what is their social structure. And for me, it was like this extra passion and extra reason to come back to Fiji every year to try and work out what is going on with this bird.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. And you are clearly very passionate about the Natewa Silktail and birds in general, which I obviously know. You were the first ornithologist to ever put a bird in my hand and show me misnetting. And I know the impact that can often have on other people's perception of conservation and care for wildlife. So taking a quick step back before we dive back into Fiji, what made you first realize your passion for birds and conservation?
The immediate answer to this when people ask me is always my dad. He was definitely my biggest inspiration growing up. It's kind of a strange one because he was showing me birds from the pram. I don't remember this obviously, but he often regales me with stories of showing me my first lammergeier or whatever from the pram. And I think growing up, because it was almost like forced on me, look at this bird, look at this bird, I pretended to be interested to kind of to appease him, really, to keep him happy. But over the years, I think I only fooled myself, and I tried so hard to appease him that I actually found it all quite interesting, and it grew into a passion quite quickly when I was younger. My mum's also a botanist by education. That's what she studied at university. And I was also very lucky as a kid, me and my sister traveling with the family, we went to fairly remote, far-flung places of the world that kind of looking back when me and my sister were like 5 and 7 going to the back of beyond of Kenya, I wouldn't have wanted to have done it as a parent, but they did it. And it's definitely, for me and my sister, like given us an appreciation of nature that we never would have had before, because I think you can quite easily become saturated by, especially in the UK, with kind of a limited biodiversity and not a whole load of wild spaces around you. You can kind of become saturated with it. But going to all these places, you're seeing these new things, these new places, these new cultures, these new birds, this just a totally different world. And it definitely enhanced my passion for nature and the natural world. And I think in terms of conservation, I think it's a natural progression from a passion for birds. It's a natural progression for an appreciation of the natural world and a desire to protect and conserve it. So I couldn't really pinpoint when my kind of passion for conservation came in, but I think it's a natural one for anyone that has an appreciation for wildlife.
Of course. Well, you're very lucky to have those experiences, and obviously one of those few people I think I've met who are excited, always excited to go to a different place to see what birds there might be there. An ornithologist thing. So going back to Fiji, obviously we talked a little bit about the remoteness of the Natewa Peninsula, which of course doesn't only affect the wildlife, but that peninsula is populated with many, many communities that live all the way up until the very tip of the peninsula. how does Opwall cooperate with the local communities and Fiji, and how does our work with them connect to the conservation and research going on in Fiji right now?
Yeah, so I mean, as people who listen to this podcast will be aware by now, everything Opwall does in every project around the world, they're pretty reliant. I mean, they're kind of totally reliant on the collaboration and the knowledge of the local communities that work in these areas that we have projects in. And Fiji is absolutely no different, and possibly even more connected with the villages that we work with, if not only because of the kind of homestay period that we have in the Fiji project. So the first couple of nights when the students arrive, they will stay in the village of Busaratu or Natewa, which are the two communities we work closest with. And this is kind of a side of the project that I don't think any other project in Opwall has. I don't know if I'm right in saying that. But yeah, one of the few certainly. And actually, these homestay periods are one of the most popular parts of the students' experience. And you might say that, okay, well, it's a nature science research trip. So why are the students enjoying this experience more than the other? But the more you study conservation, the more you travel to these parts of the world, the more you realize that it all starts with the communities in these places. You need to understand their culture and their connection with the natural world around them to get a better appreciation of the nature itself. And the Fijian communities they live and breathe what is around them. They are pretty much totally subsistent on what's around them, the farms that they have, and in particular the kind of fishing they do on the shore of the Natewa Bay. So yeah, the local communities in Fiji are kind of the backbone of what we do there. And the work that we do is trying to contribute to the local communities in that most of these local people have an incredible knowledge of the wildlife around them, but they often don't appreciate or understand how special and unique it is on a global perspective because they've never been outside of Fiji. They may never have even been off Vanuatu. And so they don't realize that the Natewa Silktail, for example, only occurs on their peninsula. And you tell them this and you try and tell them this, and they kind of look at you like, no, you're crazy. This cannot be. Like, this little bird only occurs here. And slowly they start to become aware of this, and it kind of inspires them to treat it with even more respect than they already have for it. And slowly but surely we've done that, and it's actually, despite COVID, a lot of the projects or aspects of the project that we started have continued, despite the fact that we haven't been able to run the projects as normal for last year and this year. And these ecotourism opportunities we've created for the village have kind of started to work. So they're offering kind of hosting for visitors, showing them some of the wildlife around in the forest and on the bays. And actually, they've just built the first butterfly nursery and visitor center close to Busaratu, which will be crucial to understanding more about and protecting this incredibly special butterfly, which I can't believe we've mentioned yet, probably because it's not a bird, but the Natewa swallowtail, not to be confused with the Natewa silktail, a remarkable butterfly that we discovered in the first year of the Opwall project. A huge, beautiful, colorful butterfly, part of the swallowtail family, that it is just incredible that no one discovered it before. But again, it just goes to show how special this peninsula is, and how understudied it's been historically. But anyway, this nursery and visitor center is kind of acting as the base for allowing visitors to come and understand more, but also contributing to the direct conservation of the butterfly and also the reforestation of a lot of parts of the peninsula, which is crucial.
Wow, that's excellent to hear. And, great news that the pandemic, I guess, didn't slow down all of the research completely, even with Fiji's borders closed for now
nearly 2 years. You've mentioned really that the local communities are really the key to Fiji's continuing biodiversity and why the Natewa Peninsula still has these incredible species. On the other hand, what are the major challenges to conservation of unique wildlife in Fiji right now?
I think it's initially there's a big gap in knowledge and data, especially for this area, the Natewa Peninsula. And that's partly why Opwall chose to work there, because there is this gap and we can kind of help to fill that gap. And so obviously the first step to determining anything about an area is to collect the initial foundation data, the baseline data. And not only does this tell you what's there, what's not there, but it also starts to highlight threats to that area. And one of the major threats we found, and we kind of assumed or knew that it was going to be a threat before going there, was the mongoose, the presence of the non-native invasive small Indian mongoose. And the mongoose is kind of one of the most troublesome critters in conservation, because it's just voracious. It's very generalist. It pretty much eats anything that it can get its hands on, breeds like wildfire, and is just very adaptable to urban areas, forested areas, anywhere really. And its population has clearly boomed, even on this very isolated peninsula of Natewa. And we started to do kind of surveys on these mongoose to try and figure out how far into the forest, how far up the mountains do these guys occur, and to get an idea of the extent of the threat of these creatures. And we just found them everywhere, in pretty much as much abundance as in the secondary forest as in the primary forest, which is crazy to think. And inevitably, this is having a massive effect on the biodiversity. Not so much the birds, although we still need to collect a lot of evidence to prove that, but particularly on the herpetofauna, so the amphibians and reptiles. And Fiji has an awful lot of endemic amphibians and reptiles, and it's been one of the big kind of areas that we've really seen a big gap in the abundance of these things. Like we found one Fiji tree boa in 3 years working there, and I think it was in 2018 that I found the Fiji ground frog for the first time in very little isolated pocket around this ravine. And slowly but surely we found a few more examples of these amphibians occurring, but their absence was clear from the start, and this is almost certainly down to the mongoose. Unfortunately, with these invasive species, like, it's one of these big kind of difficult stories to deal with, and I myself personally have a real sit on the fence attitude to this, whereby you know that these creatures are almost definitely having an impact on the native fauna, but at the same time we put it there. And you know, the animal ethics kind of argument to it all is that what do you do with these creatures? You pretty much have to kill them and wipe them out. And this, to me, my morals and my ethics is a really difficult kind of thing to come around to, but it needs to be done. And if you want to conserve an area, then you need to be a bit brutal sometimes. So the mongoose is kind of the main threat, but also there's a lot of deforestation starting to appear on the peninsula. A lot of outside investors, particularly from China, are starting to buy up land and putting sheep on the land and stuff. And as soon as you introduce grazing to a region that hasn't experienced that sort of land use before, you create all sorts of problems. And also the local people have this kind of agricultural process of clearing quite big parts of the forest to plant their crops. And this is another reason why we go and work in these areas, to establish how much of a threat that really is. because you have to think these communities have existed on this peninsula for hundreds of years, and they will have influenced that landscape for that length of time, if not more. And so are these little patches of clearance for agriculture actually having such an impact on these creatures, on these birds? And it's difficult to say. As I say, like, we're only 3 years in, and you need quite detailed studies into this sort of thing to really establish an evidence base for one side or the other. But it's very easy to come in and as a Westerner and a foreigner and say, look, stop cutting down all these trees just to plant some roots. You know, you could try this way or that way, but don't do it your way. But actually, without the evidence base to prove that this is actually having an impact, then you cannot come into these areas and say that sort of thing. And even if you do have the evidence, you need to be extremely gentle and careful about the way you approach it, and try and get it to come from the community to realize these sorts of things rather than telling them what to do.
That's a fantastic overview of what's going on. And obviously, you know, Fiji is a very fragile ecosystem, is such a small set of islands in the South Pacific. And I just have a couple more questions for you, and just one more about Fiji specifically, which is, you know, Fiji obviously is recognized globally as a paradise. It's basically, you know, one of the brands of paradise islands on Earth. But working on a small South Pacific island, small island developing state, brings some very unique challenges. What have been a few of the things that have surprised you about working in Fiji? What do you love the most about working there? Because I know it's so close to your heart. And is there anything you wish you'd known before you went?
Yeah, I think that the obvious one, and probably the one you were thinking of when you asked this question, is the concept of time in Fiji. The Fijians are actually very proud of it, and they call it Fiji time, and they put it on shirts and they put it on all sorts of souvenirs you can get there. And it's very similar to a lot of islands, actually, where this idea of time is almost non-existent, and it's kind of just this ebb and flow of doing what you want when you want and going with the flow, you know. And it's actually a beautiful way of existing. But when you're trying to run a project with 30 or 40 school students that are used to a timetable and expect a timetable and fairly regimented timeframes to be getting up, and when's dinner and when's lunch and when should we be doing this, you kind of need to have a concept of time. And I know you, especially when you were trying to run the homestay for the first year, this was a particular challenge, but it was a challenge for all of us to get to grips with it and try and come to a compromise, because again, you cannot force these concepts of time onto someone when they just have no concept of time. I mean, you have to think that very few of these local people have a conventional job. They're subsistence farmers, and so if they need to do something on the farm, they'll just go and do it. They don't need to get there at 9 o'clock because the boss is waiting with his watch, wondering when he's going to check in, you know. And so they have no real reason to stick to a schedule. And it's this compromise of, look, guys, you need to kind of be here when we say, because we've got a group of students who are paid to be here, and also embracing it a little bit. And actually, as I say, it's a really nice way of existing. And I think towards the end of everyone's stay there, they definitely appreciate it for what it is, and enjoy a bit more of a relaxed approach to time and stuff. So I think that was the biggest kind of culture shock or surprise or difficulty working in Fiji. But as I say, it's also one of the joys. And I mean, I couldn't do this podcast without mentioning the genuine warmth and hospitality of the Fijian people. They have so little in kind of materialistic terms, but they want to give you everything. Everything they have, they want to give you. They want to open the house to you. I always remember in the first year, they, because of the homestays, it was kind of a requirement, Opwall safety, security, privacy standard, to have locks on the doors of the bedrooms. And this was just a totally alien concept to these people and to these houses, because there's not a lock on a single door. And that's because of the sense of community. People just arrive at a house and get anything from dinner to a haircut, they'll just turn up and they will be welcomed, and they will just share everything they have in these villages. And so the concept of a lock on a door is like, why would we need that? But it's beautiful. And I know you spent time in these villages when students weren't there, and this is not to say that it wasn't an authentic experience when students were there, because it was, but they really go above and beyond to make it like a party atmosphere. They do the traditional dancing, and they lay out a wonderful spread of food, very different from the usual fieldwork spaghetti and rice. And it's a beautiful experience. It's a wonderful experience. But when you spend time alone in these villages without this kind of, I don't want to call it a facade, but like this introducing this kind of over exaggerated experience for these students, you start to really appreciate just how hand to mouth it is, the real sense of community, and everything about the real Fiji, the authentic Fiji, behind what most people experience in these resorts, where they sit on a beach with a cocktail and then hop back onto their cruise ship. And it's so far beyond that, the real Fiji that I know we've both got sort of lived and breathed.
Yeah, the people of Fiji are truly probably the kindest people on earth. Certainly everyone who's been there and had one-on-one interactions with Fijian village communities feels this way. I think any student who's been to Fiji hearing this will feel the same way. So I completely agree. Well, I just have a couple more questions about you, Joe. Obviously, you are early in a conservation career. You have worked in many more countries than you've even talked about on this podcast. I think a lot of people listening, to the Opwall podcast are thinking about going into a career in conservation, or wondering how they can be more supportive of, one of the major crises that's happening for our generation, especially. What advice do you have for people who are looking to start out a conservation career, or what advice do you have for your younger self when you were starting out?
It's such a good question, and it's a question you often get asked, particularly by students on Opwall. I think the secret is to just take every opportunity that you're given. And a lot of people aren't given opportunities, and you need to seek them. So seek them. But everyone will have something around them where they can tap into. It might not directly be conservation. It might not directly be working with birds. It might not be something that is directly linked to what you think or you want to do. But, and I use that word think tactically, because a lot of people, when they're young and they're leaving school, think they know what they want to do. In fact, they think they're certain they know what to do. But I know very few people that have gone straight from school or university and started doing what they end up doing. They go on all sorts of a wild roller coaster ride of trying this, trying that, doing this, going there. And I think that's the key, is try as much of what you're offered and what you can find as possible. Even if that's working in a sanctuary or a kind of a volunteer program for litter picking or something. It's all related, like caring for the environment, caring for animals. And the more you can get under your belt that shows you have a passion and you want to follow that passion, I think people realize that. And it's not about doing this course and doing that course and getting this license. And yes, it can be about that, but as long as you show a genuine passion and a genuine concern for the world around you, And I think if you live that, then you will naturally be drawn to the sorts of activities, the sorts of people that will help you in the future. And I kind of touched on something there without meaning to, but it's kind of made me think about it, is people are so important. And it's this horrible term of not what you know, it's who you know, which I don't really like, but it's not about knowing the boss of this company so you can then get a job with them. It's not about that. It's just surrounding yourself with people that also have that concern and passion. And if you surround yourself with those sorts of people, there's this network that you create. And it's amazing in the field of conservation and animal behavior and all of this sort of stuff, the connections between people. Like, I always am surprised and shocked at, like, you know this person from there? How do you know that person? Oh, we worked together in Borneo 5 years ago, and it's very difficult to find someone that doesn't know someone you know.
Yes, it's a small world.
It is a small world. And so this networking is more important than ever, I think, in conservation.
Yeah, I think what a beautiful point about, living your passion in conservation and doing whatever it is that gets you doing that. I mean, even just building a pond in your backyard or, cleaning litter out of the local park is impacting, things close to your home. And I remember, you made me think about our first vegetation scientist in Ecuador, who was a whale scientist, a cetacean scientist, but she was so passionate about being in the field and helping a community and working with nature that she was out with us, as a vegetation scientist in Ecuador. And all of those things come together. And I'm sure there have been times that you've gone out and volunteered and helped with conservation that hasn't specifically been birds, because it's all connected, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously, you've traveled a lot for conservation. You've been on a number of field work projects. What is the craziest or coolest thing you've ever seen in the field?
Well, I was tempted to say the first time I caught and ringed a silktail, Natewa Silktail, which was a pretty special occasion for the reasons I've already mentioned. I also had a pretty wonderful encounter, close encounter with a brown bear on my birthday last year here in Romania. Partly special just because it was my birthday. But I think the most exciting encounter I've ever had was in Sabah in Borneo. And this was in my gap year after leaving school, and I was volunteering in Sabah. And it was just before I was due to leave this fieldwork center. And I hadn't seen elephants, these Bornean pygmy elephants, which I'd heard about and wanted to see since I'd arrived. And they performed this kind of migration up and down the Kinabatangan River, which we were working on. And some of them are radio collared. And we got the news that these elephants were heading towards us. And I had a matter of days hoping that they would reach us before I had to leave. And to speed things up, after a survey one day, I can't remember exactly what the survey was, but me and a friend and two guides, I think it was, in the boat with us, decided to let's just go up the river a bit and see if we can see these elephants. And we traveled up the river, and before you see these elephants, you hear them, and it's the trumpeting and the growling and the noises of these elephants that you notice first. And it's that in itself would have been an experience, like this growling, just sitting silently on the river, listening to them trampling the trees and the reeds, would have been an experience. But fairly stupidly, and I wouldn't recommend this to anyone, is we got out the boat downriver of where they were heading, and our idea was to try and hop out the boat, see if we could see them, hop back in the boat, no problem. But we couldn't see them, and so we kind of walked further and further from the boat. And all of a sudden, we kind of realized, they're like not so far away. And we could hear the trampling of everything first. And the guide at one point turned to us and said, we need to find a tree to climb. And in these rainforests, that you kind of have this understory layer of sapling trees, which you definitely can't climb, and versus an elephant, there's no point climbing them anyway. And then you have the much larger trees in the canopy. And it's actually quite difficult to find a tree with low branches to climb. And so we were running around like headless chickens in this rainforest with these elephants getting closer and closer, and without finding a tree to climb. Eventually, we found this fallen tree, which was leaning against another tree. And we decided to scramble up that, 4 of us, and sit precariously all on this kind of half rotting log, waiting for these elephants. And the idea of climbing a tree, if you hadn't guessed already, is that we didn't have time to get back to the boat, and these elephants were coming. And if you are on the ground with a herd of 60 elephants coming towards you, it's not going to end well. And so the aim was to get above them, and they would just pass underneath us, which is exactly what happened. And these elephants, I think, are about 2.5, 3 meters tall at the shoulder, the males. And we could have only been about 3 meters up in this tree. And so you can only imagine how close some of these elephants were passing below us. And it was a herd of 50 or 60 elephants, and they all just passed us. And I've never had so much adrenaline from anything in my life, I don't think. Like, I was just shaking, like so excited. And I had my camera with my telephoto lens on it, and they were so close I couldn't take a photo. I was shaking too much to take a photo anyway. But that's got to be my kind of wildlife encounter of my life, I think. It was just
That is an amazing story, and so usually my favorite question to ask, because we get such great stories from scientists who end up out in these incredibly remote places where really just the local people have ever been. Well, to end us out on a positive note, although that was a pretty great one, why do you personally believe we should keep fighting to protect biodiversity and prevent climate change? And really, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
I think we as humans like to attach kind of values to things, and we want to save something or we want to fight for something because it has a value to us. And there's these things called biodiversity values. So biodiversity has a value for various different reasons, and 99% of these seem to revolve around our value, human values for biodiversity. So aesthetic value, we like looking at them. They have economic value because they provide ecosystem services to us. They have a social or a cultural value because we've used them for generations as feathers for crowns or whatever. But when I first heard about these values, the one that resonated with me the most was what's called intrinsic value or existence value. And that's the idea that biodiversity has a value because it's existing, because it has a right to exist, because it's part of the natural world. And regardless of what value we attach to it, surely it has as much right to exist as we do. And I think it gets said a lot that, yeah, we're humans too. We're humans are nature too. But I think it's something that we actually need to live more, and not just say, but actually act on the fact that we're part of it all, that we shouldn't be above it. And we should instinctively want to protect it, not because of a sense of duty, but because we're part of it, you know. And this whole thing about there's no planet B and whatever is true. It might be a bit cliche and cheesy, but you know, there is none. And I really don't understand why people aren't more connected to this idea that we are connected to it, and so we should want to protect it and feel obliged to protect it in a way. And yeah, if you ask me what gets me out of bed in the morning, there's this beautiful quote from my favorite book, which I'd advise anyone to read. It's called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, actually based in America. an American author. And she says, beauty and grace are performed whether or not we will or sense them. The least we can do is try to be there. And I think that sums up perfectly why I get out of bed in the morning, especially in places like here in Romania or in Fiji. But anywhere you are, really, there's always this chance to have an encounter or a moment in nature that was just never ever going to be replicated again. It's a once in a lifetime unique moment that you can be witness to, and why not, try to be there and see it.
Well, that's a beautiful way for us to end out today. Thank you so much for joining us from Romania, Joe. I really appreciate it. Joining us from Romania to talk about Fiji. It was wonderful to talk to you and have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a treat.
Thank you for tuning in to Opwall's Field Notes. We hope you were inspired by Joe's words to search for the intrinsic beauty in all of nature and live a life committed to the planet's and therefore our own survival. Please do be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on new episodes about conservation and biodiversity hotspots around the world, coming soon on Opwall's Field Notes.